Laura Burns, Head of Terrorism Research at George Washington University's Program on Extremism. We are missing Jennifer Baker today because she's out on some extremely important research topics. But we'll get started on this week's episode. Thank you for joining us for our continuing documentary on the evolution of Hamas in the United States. Before we get to the topic that we're going to be discussing today, let's recap what has happened to the United States-based infrastructure of Hamas in the early 2000s. In 2001, a federal search warrant was executed on Infocom, which was run by the Alashi brothers, relatives of Hamas leader Musa Abu Marzouk. And those brothers were Ghassan Alashi, Basman Alashi, and Bayan Alashi. Also involved with the IAP, and as we will recall, Ghassan Alashi was the leader in the Holy Land Foundation as well. Basman Alashi, if you will recall, was on the list of the original US-based Hamas leaders, number 18, I believe he was. And then later in 2001, the United States government designated the Holy Land Foundation as a front for Hamas, based on its provision of support to Hamas charities, schools, social clubs, where children were systematically indoctrinated to believe that hate was the answer and that violence was their solution. The HLF appealed that designation through the highest courts, claiming that the allegations were not true, but courts upheld the designation, finding ample evidence to support the fact that the HLF was a front for Hamas. And then in 2002 and 2003, Ghassan Alashi, Bayan Alashi, Basman Alashi, and Infocom were convicted of various terrorism-related charges, including shipping to state sponsors of terror, lying about it, and dealing in the funds of Musa Abu Marzouk, who was a designated terrorist himself at the time, and camouflaging their dealings as something other than what they were, which is something they were very good at. Moving forward, in 2004, the United States government had uncovered the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas archives at the home of Ismail el-Barase. Also in 2004, the United States government indicted the HLF and 5 of its officers for provision of material support to Hamas. The IAP, Hamas's propaganda machine in the U.S., kept operating and spreading its propaganda to ever-growing audience, which is scary. CARE continued to knowingly and falsely depict the U.S. government's war on terror and its actions against the U.S.-based Hamas apparatuses as a war on all Muslims, with the purpose of instilling fear in the Muslim community and intimidating others. Around this time, Ahmed Yusuf, the head of the UASR, the third original Hamas front, left the United States and traveled to Gaza to serve as the political advisor for Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. And let's take a minute to go back to the lawsuit that was filed by David Boehm's family against the HLF, the IAP, and others for their role in supporting Hamas. Remember, that lawsuit was based on the claim that they were liable for David Boehm's death at the hands of Hamas because they were Hamas fronts. Well, in 2004, a jury found that those organizations were, in fact, Hamas fronts.
The defendants were organizations here in the United States that were providing material support to Hamas. And that included the Holy Land Foundation. It also included an organization called the Islamic Association for Palestine. And under the Anti-Terrorism Act, even though this murder took place in Israel, far from the United States, the Boehms were able to sue these organizations here in Chicago and ended up obtaining a judgment against them for $52 million that, pursuant to the provisions of the statute, was trebled. So they had a judgment for $156 million against these organizations. Well, Holy Land Foundation relatively quickly went out of business, with 5 of its leaders being carted off to prison for their support of terror. And the Islamic Association for Palestine essentially just stopped operating rather than having to continue operating under the onus of this huge judgment. They just went out of business.
So as a result, the IAP shuttered its doors and went out of business, essentially to avoid paying a judgment. But it quickly became clear that the leaders of the IAP opened a replacement organization, just one using a slightly different name.
We became aware that there was another organization called American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, that was formed essentially just as IAP was going out of business. And it was formed essentially to carry on exactly the same activities of AMP. It had the same, I'm sorry, of IAP. It had the same mission, the same conventions, the same speakers, a lot of the same donors, a lot of the same leadership.
We will come back to the AMP in later episodes, but today we'll hear from two very esteemed guests, retired FBI special agents and former FBI legal attachés in Tel Aviv, who will share unique perspectives with us on what it was like to live and work in Israel amid constant tragedy and death at the hands of terrorists funded and supported by the US-based network.
So I'm Rusty Rosenthal. I'm currently the Executive Director of Community Security for the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, doing security consulting for the entire region of the Greater Washington area of all the Jewish community and its institutions. I'm a retired FBI agent of 25 years, 11 of which I spent in Tel Aviv. I was originally sent there as the assistant legal attaché, the deputy in the office, did a second tour in that capacity, and then went back as the legal attaché, the head of that office, before retiring.
Hi, I'm Kerry Gleischer. I joined the FBI in 1989 after working on Wall Street for a few years. I had the great fortune in 1996 to be selected to go out to Tel Aviv and open the FBI's 36th office in Israel. It was an amazing experience. I wound up spending, during 3 different tours, 11 years in Israel. And I wound up spending 15 years abroad, also in Austria and Singapore. Well, in the mid-1990s, the then director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, decided to expand the FBI's operations overseas to counter Russian organized crime. And the FBI office in Athens, Greece, legal attaché Legat, we'll refer to FBI offices as Legat, Athens covered quite a number of countries, including Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. And the director at that time saw a great need to open an office in Israel. I spent a few weeks in Athens learning the ins and outs, and landed in Israel for the first time in my life in 1996. I was 33 years old. It was an unbelievable experience. I went, of course, to the US Embassy. That's where the FBI offices are housed under the umbrella of the US Ambassador. And then I started going out and making contacts with the Israeli law enforcement and intelligence authorities. And for a young FBI agent, it was the highlight of my career. Our Washington field office had extraterritorial responsibility for investigating acts of terrorism abroad. And when there is an act of terrorism and an American citizen is killed or injured, the FBI has primacy in that investigation. So whenever there was an act of terrorism, and look, we had the Second Intifada, the uprising by the Palestinians and Hamas. While I was there were buses flying in the air every day, and it wasn't just buses, it was restaurants and social places. And we used to say that at any time, 10% of the population in Israel were either dual nationals or tourists, American tourists visiting. So when there's a tragic attack and 10 people are killed, and it was normally a lot more than 10 or injured, we always thought there'd be at least one American injured.
I arrived to Tel Aviv for the first time in 2006, so 10 years after Kerry first opened the office, and I'd benefited from Kerry and others before me's work. In Tel Aviv, by that time, I mean, they're a first world country, very sophisticated law enforcement and intelligence services, so we were sort of off to the races and able to work at a very high level with very capable and willing partners. We were able to see, you know, the brutality and the horrible, you know, effects of Hamas activities up close, being in Tel Aviv and in Israel, obviously. Whereas I think back in America, certainly our citizens, but even the government, Hamas wasn't necessarily a very high priority.
2003 was a particularly difficult year for us in Tel Aviv. Particularly difficult for the FBI and for the country, and all the components of the US Embassy and the citizens. In March of 2003, a 14-year-old girl boarded a bus in Haifa. Her name was Abigail Lytle. And Abigail was born in New Hampshire, and her family moved to Israel to be part of a Baptist ministry there. And she wasn't a politician, she wasn't a warrior, she was a teenage girl on her way to school, and there was a suicide bomber, a Hamas suicide bomber, who came on the bus and detonated his bomb, killing 19, including 9 teenagers. Again, an American citizen was killed, so the FBI exerts primacy in the investigation from a U.S. standpoint. Of course, the Israelis do everything. The police respond to the scene, they cordon off, they gather evidence, they coordinate with the Domestic Intelligence Service in Israel, the Israeli Security Agency, trying to determine who the terrorist was, where the funding came from, who the leadership was. But it was one of those experiences, when you work in law enforcement for 30 years, you get to see the good, the bad, and the really ugly in humanity. And as a representative of the US Embassy, I went to her funeral, and again, because of her Baptist background, you had a cross etched into the coffin, and it was draped in the flags of the United States and Israel. So it was just a very difficult time to see the Jewish star on the Israeli flag next to a cross next to the American flag. And this was a young lady who had joined a school group trying to foster building relationships between Israeli youth and Palestinian youth. So a teenage activist trying to bring 2 different cultures together, and yet she was an American. And it was just one of those awful times where, with acts of terrorism, you see the loss of innocence. What she would have done in her life would have been remarkable, and to what end? Like, why blow up? Why kill any innocent people? But it's a bus, and those who ride buses in Israel are normally students and people who can't afford cars, poor people. So it just kind of tied everything together in law enforcement, seeing the tragic results of a Hamas terrorist, his action for a senseless purpose. The Israel police did an incredible study on suicide bombing, and they told me that they interviewed suicide bombers to see what was their motivation in doing it. And I thought, wow, they're really good if they can interview suicide bombers. You'll have times where a suicide bomber will go and detonate the device and it won't detonate, and then they're captured, or they go and they chicken out. And so they interviewed them, and it was done by the crisis negotiation unit of the police. And I just found it fascinating because they talked about one particular person who, his device didn't detonate. He tried to detonate it, so he didn't chicken out. And they asked him why. And he said, in every square, in Gaza, there are town squares. And every time there's a jihadist, someone who killed themselves in the name of God, they put their posters up on the wall. And the women are very attracted to those jihadists. And he said, I'm not a handsome, this is what he's telling the crisis negotiators. I'm not a handsome guy, I was never good with women, and I wanted to be attractive to women. So they said, think of the rationale. He wants to blow himself up so women would be attracted to him. He was a vulnerable soul, immature, a teenager, easily recruitable, and did it not to kill Jews, or in the name of Islam, he did it to be attractive to women.
You know, the glorification of these jihadists sort of plays into the next incident, right, that I was on the ground for, along with Kerry, was Taylor Force. Taylor Force was a West Point graduate. He'd served tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and was then getting his MBA at Vanderbilt, I believe. In 2016, he and other students were visiting Israel to study global entrepreneurship. And he was just walking on the very busy, high traffic area, the boardwalk, what they call the Tayelet, along the beach between Tel Aviv and Jaffa. And he was attacked and murdered by a knife assailant, basically doing the same thing, Hamas inspired. And again, so it's a U.S. citizen victimized, killed by an act of terror overseas. So the FBI then has primacy from the U.S. standpoint.
So, as I mentioned earlier, 2003 was a tough year. And the morning of October 15th, 2003, the two of us from the FBI office were in the embassy's cafeteria having coffee, and there were three employees of DynCorp. They were contractors for the embassy's security detail. So we were having coffee with them, and they were heading to Gaza that day with a convoy of senior U.S. Department of State employees to conduct Fulbright scholarship interviews of academics in Gaza. What a noble cause, right? To build bridges between the U.S. and the Palestinians in Gaza. And on their way down in the convoy, there was a massive roadside bomb, an IED. They were in a fully armored Suburban. The fully armored vehicle flipped upside down, was almost split in half, and 3 Americans were killed. John Branchizio, who had the nickname Cheese, was a Navy SEAL. John Lind was a non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, and Mark Parsons was the third. This was the first time that a U.S. Embassy vehicle was targeted in Gaza for an attack. So we immediately saw that this was a change of tactics, and the FBI and other components of the embassy immediately responded. We had the FBI's fly team from Washington, D.C. come out with bomb experts and fingerprint experts and interviewing experts, and we got right to work trying to figure out who was responsible for this. We were traveling down into Gaza every single day to meet with this group to try to figure out who was responsible. We were meeting in a place just south of the Erez crossing, which is the checkpoint into Gaza from Israel, one of them. And the building where we met was riddled with bullet marks and mortar shells. It was an unbelievable, surreal place to meet under the photo of Yasser Arafat. And I knew these guys, so it particularly hits home. And you came to realize very quickly that this group was a puppet group of Yasser Arafat's, and that there was no real intention of getting justice, especially against a U.S. convoy, which was going down there for the good of the people. I can't begin to tell you what it's like to have to make family contacts and have to return heroes who served in the military and pack their coffins and send them back home to Dover after an event like that. And again, it changed everything for us. Since that time, essentially, the U.S. Embassy has closed down travel to Gaza.
They were having so many incidents, around the time of the Intifada, that their philosophy as a country for their own psyche is to clean up the mess and move on. They get coffee shops that were attacked open within a day or two, and they want to get their life back to normal, and that's their policy. Whereas in the United States, we want to put yellow tape up and work a crime scene, and look at every evidence and every piece of evidence and every piece of dust for the next several months. So sometimes we would run into some conflict because the FBI wanted to have them conduct a traditional investigation like we would do over here, whereas they want to get back to normalcy within their own society because they're more focused on preventing the next attack that they know is being planned.
Which is a perfect intro to the Mike's Place attack. Again, 2003, there's a bar adjacent to the US Embassy facing the beach. It's a place that everybody from the embassy would go for happy hour on Friday. This Mike's Place was a popular beachfront bar that had live music that would normally go to 3, 4 in the morning. And because it was on the beach, you had such a diverse crowd of expats who had moved to Israel, tourists, you had Israelis, Americans, Europeans, the whole thing. Again, this was what we saw, a change in tactics, because Mike's Place was blown up, and it was a suicide bomber who was of Pakistani descent and entered Israel through Jordan with a European passport, a UK passport. And that's not something they had seen before. There were 2 suicide bombers. One also tried to detonate his vest. The Israelis aren't sure, but they believe he was injured, and they found him a few days later near the Mediterranean Sea. He had drowned in the sea. So whether he was trying to escape or he was injured and that was his way of getting out. But there were 4 people killed, no Americans, a musician, 3 people killed. A security guard who had stopped the suicide bomber before he got in. He recognized something was wrong. He was also killed, but he saved a lot of lives. And a young French woman, her first name was Dominique, who used to serve us every Friday night, a beautiful lady, and tragically gone, adjacent to the US Embassy. It opened a week later, and there was a line wrapping around the block to get in. There was an article in the Jerusalem Post written by an American who moved to Israel, during the Intifada, and the title of the article was Israel, a place where life goes through you. And it's all about carpe diem, seize the moment. You never know what tomorrow is going to bring, but that doesn't stop us from living our lives. It was a brilliant story, and it was so heartening. Again, adjacent to the US Embassy, to see the line go around the block.
Hey, hey,